I'm Nick Redding. I'm the president and CEO of Preservation Maryland, which is obviously the sponsor of this and is the recipient of Harrison's generosity in this um, program. And obviously we wouldn't be here if it weren't for Harrison, who kind of brought us all together, and whose, again, generosity is making it possible. And the value that we see in this as a statewide group that obviously has and maybe you don't know this, but is the philanthropic partner of the Historic Preservation Training Center and the Western Center for Historic Preservation. We see our role is in sort of supporting, like all preservation groups, the advancement of the movement and of research and thinking big about difficult and diverse and unique challenges and obstacles. And so the opportunity to actually invest in this and to provide support to some really compelling fellows was exciting for us. And obviously they've been our guinea pigs for this first go around, and we are advertising the second round now, and have worked out a lot of the kinks that some of you don't even know, but we've had a lot of back end work to try and make all of this work. But I just want to thank not only Harrison, but also the committee that's come together to help us not only vet these, but support these. And of course, then the mentors who signed up to help these folks out and sort of thinking through all of this. And my hope for this program is that people begin to look to this as one of the true few opportunities in the field to support mid-career research in preservation. There's not a lot out there about that, and it's desperately needed, because preservation has huge opportunities and obviously huge challenges. And I think that both of these projects kind of speak to that, both in interesting and diverse ways, from policy to actually the physicality of preservation, which is a nice span of sort of showing the diversity of this. And it's great to have someone like Harrison. I will say this, that most donors and sponsors of things like this prescribe or pre-prescribe exactly what they want to see come out of this. And, I want to fund things that are specifically like this, or I want this specific thing. And I think the beauty of this is that Harrison wanted to kind of see where the applicants came, and sort of meet the field where the field needs support. And so this is super exciting. This is year one, hopefully the first of many years. And we're thrilled to be partnering on this, and hope to grow the program in future years. And I know we wanted to give Harrison an opportunity just to say hello and say a few words, so I wanted to offer that as well now.
Hello, good morning all, and thank you very much for being a part of this whole process. I think Nick said much of what I was going to be talking about, actually, is that we're involved in something that I think is innovative and exceptional in terms of historic preservation. We're at the beginning of this process, quite honestly, and as you all know, we're trying to figure it out as we go along as to what makes the most sense, what and what brings the most distinguished amount to the fellowship program itself. So I encourage you to participate, to make remarks, to help make improvements as this goes along, and mainly to spread that business of confidence and pride. And those happen to be the two elements that I happen to see in preservation in my travels anyway. And why not? It's just a good thing for all of us to do. It seemed like it worked on the first round when we had 82 applicants that applied for this program and for a fellowship. And even though not all of them, in fact, all but two were selected, it means that people are beginning to think about what they can do that's exceptional how to make a mark, how to make a difference in preservation. So I'm very proud, obviously, of this first year and how all this has come together, and I certainly appreciate the efforts that all of you are putting into this to make it a going thing. So if you can expand your information to others and bring others into the field, not just necessarily for a fellowship, but so that we can enhance the leadership and the competence of work that's throughout the field of preservation. And I endorse what Nick has said, is that yes, there's a lot of focus here on people that are within the field now practicing, and some that are in graduate school ready to come into this program. I think this year's example of 2 practicing preservationists, if you will, are the beginning shot here, and go for it. Spread the word. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, and hopefully post-COVID in the future, maybe we can do some convenings of current and past fellows, and maybe Catherine can host us out there at her Dude Ranch. I wanted to give the committee just so everybody knows who the committee members are. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start with Lisa, and then Lisa, you can just pass it off to the next committee member, and we'll go through that way and have committee members sort of pass the torch to each other. So Lisa, you want to just introduce yourself, your quick background, your association with this, just so people know who you are.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Harrison. This is such a wonderful honor to be part of this program that Harrison has enabled. I'm Lisa Sasser. I'm a historical architect and a graduate of the National Park Service Historic Preservation Trades Training Program. And I have worked with the Park Service for 30 years as an employee, and have subsequently worked with them on training and development, and also have the pleasure of working with Nick and Jessica as a member of the Board of Preservation Maryland. And with that, I'd like to pass it to Stephanie.
Thanks, Lisa. And I want to echo much of what you said. It's been a real honor to be asked to serve on this group and support the fellowship. I've admired the work that Harrison has done in so many areas over the course of his career and mine. And I, as Associate Director for the National Park Service for the Historic Preservation Programs, I'm very much aware that this is an area which is growing in complexity, but not in terms of funding. We definitely need to continue to support training in the trades, but also training and research. And this fellowship was well targeted to try to encourage that. So I'm very excited to hear the final preservation presentations, and thank Harrison again. So let me see who else is here so I can pass it off. How about to Don?
Thank you. I'm Don Peeting. I live in Oregon. I'm a historical architect as well. I've taught for years at the University of Oregon and was in charge of the preservation program for a number of years as well. And my claim to fame is having started a field school that has been operating in the Pacific Northwest for 25 or 6 years now. It's been halted by COVID, but I think we're going to have it this fall. And I've managed to have a wonderful time working in preservation, and the chance to be on this committee has been terrific. Who do I pass it to?
Any other committee members?
I don't, I have very few images
No, I don't
on
think
my
so.
screen.
And we'll let the mentors be introduced during the presentations, because I think
Okay,
that
that's
kind of
great.
makes the most sense that way. And the only other folks who haven't been introduced, I guess, at this point are Catherine and then Maria. So to both of you, and then we'll have our mentors. But Catherine, do you want to, and Maria, do you want to?
Sure. So Catherine Wanson, I am the director of the Western Center for Historic Preservation out here in Moose, Wyoming, and I oversee the training operation for the Historic Preservation Training Center, as the Western Center is just the Western outpost for the Historic Preservation Training Center. And I am beyond thrilled to have been involved and invited. I'm not a committee member, but I'm kind of the NPS staff side along with Maria. Running the fellowship, and Harrison is my mentor, and we're going on, but don't look surprised. We're going on 12 years now of our professional relationship. And so this, the culmination of this year's fellowship that is happening today means a lot to me, because this was all Harrison, but he did tap me as his mentee to help get it off the ground. So I'm just happy to see this coming to fruition today. And you guys have set a nice bar for future years. And we appreciate your participation, and also mentors and fellows spreading the word to get even more people in this kind of mid-career opportunity, as Nick said and Harrison said, that are very rare, not just the NPS, but in the preservation world. So thank you. And Maria, will you introduce yourself? Because Maria has done a lot of the behind the scenes work, and she deserves a huge thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Maria Rochelle, and I've worked here at Grand Teton in the branch of cultural resources for about 3 years, but just this year I've started working with Catherine and the team at the Western Center for Historic Preservation. And as Catherine says, I've been doing a lot of the behind the scenes work. I'm sure you have all received many emails from me, so I hope you're not too annoyed just yet. But it's been really fun and really a big learning process for me too, to see what everyone's doing and how this fellowship works. So I'm happy to help wherever I can. And I'm looking forward to finally hearing the presentations.
Fantastic. Well, that's probably a good place for us to move to that. Now, Jess, I see in the agenda here that the MC, which is a very official title for me, announces presentations will be recorded separately and therefore have many introductions each time. I think we can just keep one recording going because we can edit it easily. So we don't need to stop and start. But I will do separate presentations. Some of you are probably PreserveCast listeners. I hope you are. These individuals will also, as long as they say yes, will be given an opportunity to do a PreserveCast episode to reach sort of a larger national audience with some of this. And so we'll use both video and that. And as the PreserveCast host, the only PreserveCast host, I will also do what I always do so that I don't screw it up, which is I ask the person to pronounce their name. So Chris, you say your name so that I hear it right. And it's I know it's probably easy to pronounce, but this way we don't screw it up.
Sure, Christopher Cody.
Okay, and then Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Strati.
Strati, see, I would have screwed it up.
There you go.
All right, fantastic. So now you know
Nick,
how the
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to let you know, I think the intro piece was just to maybe say something about being the Goodall, so that we don't have to go back and grab some general language about what the fellowship is, just to make editing easier at the start. Just mentioning it's part of the Goodall Fellowship, I think was the idea, to help facilitate editing, so we don't have to grab general language from the beginning of each one.
Fantastic. I can do that. All right. So I know Chris is up first. And so I will get started, and it'll sound like we're doing a recording. So it'll sound like we're restarting this now. So I'm Nick Redding with Preservation Maryland, and thrilled to be joined today by one of our inaugural Harrison Goodall Fellows. The Goodall Fellowship provides a short-term opportunity for individuals to pursue a unique self-directed project under the guidance of a mentor. And we had over 80 applicants Fellows will receive up to a $5,000 fellowship funding and will be paired with a professional project mentor. And we're thrilled to be joined by Christopher Cody, who is one of our inaugural fellows, who, in addition to serving as the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer in Phoenix, Arizona, is also working on one of the most serious, if not the most serious, preservation challenge in Arizona, which is demolition by neglect. And so his goal in this was to research and develop a model to look at demo by neglect ordinances for use across the state of Arizona, in a place where this can be a real challenge when it comes to property rights and just sort of the perception of this kind of policy. And so what are the legal barriers? What would it require to make the advocacy work to make all of this happen? And he picked a fantastic mentor, which is Will Cook, who is an attorney with Cultural Heritage Partners, and is just an expert really in this field of local preservation law and ordinances. So we're thrilled to be joined by Christopher, who is going to give his presentation on how he utilized this fellowship funding to look at this complex issue and what he found. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I am Christopher Cody, a 2020-21 Harrison Goodall Preservation Fellow. And I'd like to start by thanking all the members of the committee for all of the wonderful feedback that you all gave me during our meetings throughout the year. And especially would like to thank my mentor, Will Cook. It was incredibly valuable to be able to bounce ideas off of Will and have conversations with him throughout this process. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now in order to start my presentation. So as was just introduced, the topic that I selected for my fellowship project is preventing demolition by neglect and strategies for Arizona. And I decided to apply for this fellowship because demolition by neglect is such a serious issue in Arizona. And I knew that there was the opportunity to make significant positive change in the state and really help with this problem. But I really needed an opportunity outside of my normal duties as Deputy SHPO to take the time to study this in depth and really come up with a good, well-researched paper. I look forward to disseminating my findings widely, both through our network of CLGs and also in every other venue that I can find, conferences, preservation podcasts, all that. This fellowship really provided me personally with an excellent opportunity for professional growth. I can honestly say after this that I've added demolition by neglect as an area of expertise, and I will be able to carry that knowledge and that experience with me for the rest of my career. So I hope to continue to use this knowledge for my entire career, which I plan to be several more decades of sharing this with the preservation community. So again, thank you very much, Mr. Goodall, for the opportunity. Thank you to everyone on the committee, and thank you very much to Will for your guidance. So the images that you see on the screen in front of you are ones that I think illustrate the scale and complexity of stopping and dealing with demolition by neglect in Arizona. These images are from a town called Clifton, Arizona. It was the site of a major copper strike in the 1870s and was at its zenith in the first decades of the 20th century. Today, it has about 3,000 residents with a median income of only about $40,000 per household. And it is a 4-hour drive away from the nearest population center that has over 10,000 residents. So this is an extremely isolated place. What you're looking at is Chase Creek Road, the main commercial thoroughfare, which is over 50% vacant. All of these buildings have incredible integrity. It's about 5 blocks long. And it really illustrates and underscores that the challenges that we face with demolition by neglect in Arizona, they really are complicated. They differ greatly from places like Clifton that we're looking at to urban areas like Phoenix. So, this was a big project to understand options that would work for the varied historical environments that we have here in Arizona. So, summary of my project and what I set out to do. I researched the issue of demolition by neglect, both in Arizona and nationwide. To do that, I reviewed existing national guidance documents. The National Trust and the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions both have excellent pieces out that speak to demolition by neglect. I also read every thesis that I could find, city codes from dozens and dozens of different cities, guidance provided by other SHPOs and nonprofit organizations. And I also wound up reading a lot of building codes and using Westlaw to search for case law. So there was a lot of research that I conducted. My second goal was to identify solutions with a high probability of success in Arizona. And I want to be clear that I wasn't looking for the best solution to demolition by neglect. There is no one silver bullet best solution. I wasn't trying to identify the most comprehensive protection scheme. I was trying to figure out how to get demolition by neglect protections in a way that would work in Arizona. So I want to be clear that that was my goal. And my final deliverables are I've produced a guidance document to assist Arizona communities with preventing demolition by neglect. I very much look forward to everyone's edits once I've shared that with all of you. I fully expect once I get all of the committee's edits back to then incorporate them into a final version of the document. I do have a one-sheet summary of my findings as well, just for easy distribution at advocacy events and other preservation events. And I really look forward to sharing my work with the preservation community, both the larger guidance document once it's finalized and the one sheet. So I'll get right down to the spoiler right here. The three options that I identified for Arizona, local ordinances, enhanced code enforcement, and state legislation. None of these options are exclusive to any other. In fact, I envision all three at some level or another helping Arizona's communities establish demolition by neglect protections. I looked at other options like the legal theories of blight and nuisance law. And in looking over the diversity of Arizona's communities and all the different ways that we could attack this problem, I really have zeroed in on these three options. To no one's, local ordinances should not be a surprise to anyone. They are the most familiar way and most common way of dealing with demolition by neglect. In regards to enhanced code enforcement, during my research, I have discovered some very interesting opportunities within building codes to help prevent demolition by neglect. And lastly, for state legislation, this was sort of an aspirational discovery. When I reviewed state legislation across the country that speaks of demolition by neglect, I think that no one has quite gone all the way to creating a unified state system for the prevention of demolition by neglect. It's mostly enabling ordinances out there, or sorry, enabling statutes out there. But there are some states that have done it better than others. And I think that this is an area that's right to be a potential solution on a large scale, and that deserves to be talked about more and explored more. So we'll start by just talking about local ordinances. As I said, this is the most common method for preventing demolition by neglect. And each local ordinance is specifically tailored to individual communities. That leads to a bit of squishiness, I guess is the non-technical term, within the conversation about demolition by neglect, because there is no one consensus model ordinance nationwide. You really can't go from one community to another when you're talking about local ordinances and just cut and paste. So that results in this degree of variability that I think sort of muddies the water of the scholarly conversation about this. So local ordinances have many benefits. There's a wide range of protections available. That's one of the things that I want to talk about in this presentation, is just the great differences between local ordinances across the country. I was really struck by the range. And, you know, to be fair to local ordinances within that range, there are definitely the most comprehensive protections against demolition by neglect in local ordinances. The strongest schemes are based on local ordinances. Of that, there's no question. But to date, no communities in Arizona have enacted a local ordinance to prevent demolition by neglect. So right away, I knew that I wanted to understand this is the most commonly used method to prevent demolition by neglect. Why is no one in Arizona doing it? What are the issues with it? So to dive a little bit deeper into local ordinances, I think the National Association of Preservation Commissions really broke down the elements of a successful ordinance very well. You can see in the top left: standards, petition and action procedures, economic hardship provisions. Economic hardship provisions have to exist because of a ruling from this federal court called Mayor versus New Orleans. where it was determined that affirmative maintenance provisions can't have an undue burden on property owners, hence the economic hardship provision requirement for local ordinances, and also appeals and enforcement processes. Now, when I studied all these different elements and did a comparative analysis, I very quickly realized that really the bottom four, petition and action, economic hardship, appeals, and enforcement, there's a great degree of standardization across the country because all of these are primarily procedural aspects that are substantively constrained by due process rights, that are constitutional rights that are universal. Most of the variability in the language stems from alignment with local jurisdictional policies and procedures or state enabling laws. But when you talk about concept and theory of the right to be heard and all those sorts of things, those are pretty much universally enshrined across in local demolition by neglect ordinances across the country. So I really focused and was able to pretty much immediately nail down on the element of standards, which really another way of talking about standards is how do you define demolition by neglect? What are you going to define as a neglected building legally in your community? And that's where the great variability in concept comes in amongst local ordinances across the country. And just, I was able to, this is purely my mental organization of them, but as I looked at local ordinances, I really was able to kind of put them into three buckets. They're general ordinances, strict affirmative maintenance ordinances, and what I call structural ordinances. An example of a general ordinance is right here on the right. This is Topeka, Kansas's demolition by neglect ordinance. That's all of it. It's very simple, very general, and very broad. And there are many communities that this is how they deal with demolition by neglect in sort of a very short, general way. I have an image of Lafitte's blacksmith shop up there because it illustrates the point I'm about to make when I show you two different ordinances that different communities require different standards. Lafitte's blacksmith shop is a New Orleans landmark. You're looking at it, it's actually been rehabilitated, and the conscious choice was made to sort of preserve as much as they could a patina of decay, I would almost say. There are not many straight lines or right angles in this building. And, you know, that was something that some communities and some ordinances, this would trigger a demolition by neglect ordinance. But for New Orleans, for where it is, they wanted something different and they actually encouraged this kind of look. So, you know, with that being said, let's dive into just take a look at two ordinances. The first one I'm going to show you is an example of strict affirmative maintenance, and it's Charlottesville, Virginia's ordinance. I draw your attention to elements 4 and element 6, which prohibit the crumbling of exterior plasters and mortar and the peeling of paint. You know, this is a very aggressive demolition by neglect or affirmative maintenance ordinance. It even, in number 7, requires the affirmative maintenance of landscaping. So this is, you know, a community that has decided to go with what I call a strict affirmative maintenance or affirmative maintenance ordinance. You know, literally no decay can be seen. This is not appropriate for all communities. We just saw the example from New Orleans. This is also not something that is politically palatable in Arizona. This is a very difficult ordinance that requires a lot of social, political, community consensus around the value of preservation. So here's another example. This is actually New Orleans's ordinance. And as you can see, as you look through it, it really speaks more to structural issues. It really comes close to defining things that are being demolished by neglect as out of safety. Things that members of walls or vertical supports that lean, list, or buckle due to defective materials. You know, this is a long ways away from you can't have peeling paint on your facade. So these two ordinances, I think, really illustrate the spectrum of how different local ordinances can be across the country, which is why they have to be specifically tailored to individual communities to really meet the needs of the community, both the local social and political tolerances for these kinds of restrictions, but also the needs of the different built environments. So as I looked at this and was thinking about why we don't have any local ordinances like this in Arizona, well, first of all, good news for starters, Phoenix is currently working on one. They hope to enact the first one in the state by the end of this year. I really hope that I know that my project is going to assist them in that effort and it's going to inform some of what they do. They are looking at a standard that is closer to New Orleans that is more structural. But in talking to other communities, I come to understand that enacting a local ordinance takes a lot of work. It's not just the local willpower to do so. Even with a CLG grant from the SHPO office to hire a consultant, there's still a tremendous devotion of staff time, the public hearings, public process to enact a new ordinance. And it is, while it provides the most comprehensive protections, and while it can be specifically tailored to a community, it hasn't happened in Arizona because it's a relatively heavy lift. And when you talk about communities like Clifton that have 3,000 people, where one person might be on the HP commission and mayor and the treasurer in some of these towns, you know, it's a lot, and a lot of communities haven't gotten there just because this is such a challenging thing to do, to specifically tailor an ordinance for your community and take in public input and get it passed. So while local ordinances are by far, you know, the vast majority of scholarship out there about this issue of demolition by neglect prescribes local ordinances as a solution, it doesn't always work. It hasn't worked in Arizona. So I really tasked myself with identifying other options. And the first one that I came to was the idea of enhanced code enforcement. So the International Building Code, International Property Maintenance Code, and International Existing Building Code all prohibit unsafe structures and have empower building officials to remediate and intervene when structures are unsafe. And interestingly, the definition of an unsafe structure in all three codes should prohibit most demolition by neglect, especially the International Property Maintenance Code. It's substantively similar to what we just saw from New Orleans, where if there is visible structural neglect, if there are very clear issues with the building, all the empowerment is there for building code officials to take action. The issue, as I discovered it doing my research, is not the language that's in building codes being insufficient to prevent demolition by neglect. It's purely enforcement. I actually called 15 different building code offices around the state, and every single one of them told me that, you know, unless a building is in imminent danger of hurting someone in the public, of actually collapsing, there really is no trigger to proactively conduct an inspection on these buildings. These building code departments are set up to be fee-based, where if you're doing a substantial project that requires a permit or you're doing new construction, you pay a fee to go out and have the building code inspector look at the property. There really isn't an effective trigger in any of the jurisdictions I talked to for a building that is simply not safe per code, but doesn't pose an imminent public danger to be inspected and to have the code aggressively enforced. So that was a big light bulb that I saw, that there's this disconnect between what the law says and how building code officials are actually enforcing it. And allowing HP commissions to refer properties for code enforcement is a solution that I found that some communities had availed themselves of. There are some local ordinances that actually end in that action, a referral to the building code department. So I became very interested in that pathway, in that connection. And the image on your right is actually a personal story, sort of, about the power of building codes that I learned that didn't make it into my paper. But one of the ways that I was aware of this option is what you're looking at is Mosquito Beach out on Solagri Island in Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston had segregated beaches, and African Americans were only allowed to go to several, you know, I hesitate to even call Mosquito Beach a beach, several places. But a vibrant and thriving culture did grow up around these African-American beach communities. And this building you're looking at was the hotel at Mosquito Beach. It, as you see it there, was very much neglected. It was brought to my attention while I was working at Historic Charleston Foundation by the building code official for Charleston County, who had repeatedly noticed the owner that it was being neglected. And he then issued a demolition order on it, really just to spur the preservation community to action. And it was spurred to action. In 2017, Historic Charleston Foundation got a $43,000 civil rights grant to document the building. And this last year they got, I believe it was a $490,000 grant for the actual physical rehabilitation of the structure. But that all started with a building code official enforcing the building code. And it then triggered the saving of this building. And I know that there have been many issues with the historic preservation movement and building code officials who have condemned buildings in the past that you don't want demolished like this one. And certainly when I was dealing with the building code official and county council trying to stop the pending demolition, it was adversarial, not cooperative. But the power of building codes to really go into neglected historic buildings and force change was made perfectly apparent to me in this situation. So I became very interested a long time ago in what this could do. So I mentioned that a hybrid solution that allows historic preservation commissions to refer buildings to building code enforcement is my ideal recommendation for Arizona. The issue of getting building code officials in code departments that are set up to be fee-based to re-educate them to proactively go around enforcing building codes, or to reorient the structures of those departments for proactive monitoring, that is just too difficult of a lift. I think that is an ongoing challenge for our preservation movement that we are going to need to work to engage with the code official community to really bridge that gap conceptually much more than it is now. But in the short term, simply allowing HP commissions to identify neglected properties that aren't meeting the building code and refer them for enforcement, I think is an elegant and simple solution. The language that you see up here is from Charleston. That's how they deal with demolition by neglect. And again, there are many benefits of doing this. It relies on building code enforcement instead of a new ordinance. It brings to bear the expertise of the Preservation Commission. You're not just relying on building officials. And just as important as what it doesn't do, this isn't an adjudication. Some of the local ordinances that I came across had to involve zoning boards and quasi-judicial adjudications that really arrived at a binding determination as to whether or not demolition by neglect had occurred and empowered remediative action. This is a lot simpler because it just goes through the already existing code enforcement procedures. Charleston isn't the only community that does this. Raleigh, North Carolina also has a procedure set up whereby it actually starts with neighborhood associations that then refer properties that are suffering from demolition by neglect to the commission, and then it goes to the code official. But I really seized upon this for smaller communities as a simple way that you can leverage the knowledge of the HP commissions to get to code enforcement. So the third option that I identified was state legislation. And as I said at the outset, this is somewhat aspirational. Ideally, state legislation could essentially look like a local ordinance, like a good local ordinance, and define and prohibit demolition by neglect, establish a standardized system for enforcement and appeals. That could happen at the state level. It hasn't, though. Most states have just enacted enabling laws, and those enabling laws, they vary greatly. In Arizona and in many other states, we just have a law that empowers communities to regulate demolition in historic areas. And that's the statute that Phoenix is relying on, one that just empowers communities to regulate demolition. Other states have ordinances that specifically speak to demolition by neglect and specifically empower communities to regulate demolition by neglect. Still, other states, and this is where I think the model is trending towards a statewide unified system. Some other states have relatively detailed definitions of what constitutes demolition by neglect, and they prescribe appeals processes that are standardized. And I'm going to show you an example that looks like that, the example that I recommend for Arizona here next. But I want to make sure that everyone's aware that this option is also very attractive right now because we have had recent legislative victories in Arizona for preservation. And just in 2020, the League of Cities and Towns ran a bill that was purported to stop demolition by neglect that didn't even make it to a committee hearing because it just was poorly drafted. But it underscores that there is both momentum in our legislature behind increased preservation in Arizona, and there's a very definite awareness that demolition by neglect is a serious problem in this state. And there are a lot of folks that would love to fix it. They just haven't been presented yet with the right solution. So here is the model statute. This is actually from Mississippi that I think that Arizona should adopt. It both has a reasonable definition of demolition by neglect, not a detailed one like a local ordinance would. Again, that's a goal in the future. But it also establishes an appeals process that goes through the Mississippi SHPO office. And I think that politically, trying to sell the idea that communities should be empowered to regulate demolition by neglect will be a lot more palatable in Arizona if they knew that there was a non-local appeals process that at some level, the governor will have authority over, as opposed to just local HP commissions. So this model, I think, is excellent. I really hope that the 2022 legislative session, demolition by neglect, especially on the heels of Phoenix enacting their ordinance, will be front and center in our state. And I really would like to see Arizona have a stronger, empowering, enabling statute that also provides some of the extra details and enhancements that this Mississippi model does. So with that, we move on to my final thoughts. I really think that my primary contribution to the overall scholarly conversation is not in the area of local ordinances. Those have been written about extensively. There are good guidance documents. There are good guidance documents available to assist communities with establishing local ordinances. But coming from a state where we didn't have any, I knew that I needed to find other options. And I think that thinking creatively about the potential within building codes to help prevent this, already adopted building codes to prevent demolition by neglect, and also thinking at the higher level, like if I really wanted to solve this problem everywhere, there's no question the best thing would be a very detailed state statute. So thinking about this problem from sort of non-traditional angles, understanding that I'm dealing with a non-traditional built environment, of a very different, very challenging, very diverse built environment out here in Arizona, I think was the primary contribution that I can make, and sort of the best ideas, new creative ideas that I had came out of those studies. I will want to update this paper both after I receive all of the committee's guidance, but also after Phoenix passes their ordinance. I would like to be able to include that as I distribute it to show that someone has done this. I plan on promoting, distributing these guidance documents and promoting the idea of stopping demolition by neglect extensively through our CLG program. We have 31 CLGs in our state, and that gather regularly for trainings and conferences and whatnot. So I see that as the primary conduit to share this information and help make change happen in our state. And lastly, I really feel the need for continued outreach to the building code community. I was very surprised when I started reading these building codes at just how many tools are there that read so similarly to a lot of local ordinances, and the lack of enforcement. It happens for a lot of reasons, but it doesn't have to. And for communities that can't go to the expense of resources to enact a local ordinance, simply getting your code officials to enforce building codes against severely neglected historic structures, I mean, that pathway in and of itself, I think, will be very valuable here in Arizona. And could be valuable elsewhere in the country. So with that, I just want to say thank you again to all the members of the committee, and especially to my mentor, Will Cook. And I'd love to open up the floor for any questions or comments that anyone has.
Well, you've summarized some really significant and weighty issues into a very brief period of time. So I'm sure the silence right now is everyone trying to figure out, how to make sense of all of this. I mean, it makes a lot of sense what you say, but boy, you've raised a lot of really interesting questions, and ones that I know we see every day, and sort of this tussle too, not only with property rights, but even between local government and state government and things like that. And just sort of thinking about the implications here in Maryland, where our counties and municipalities never want to be told what to do when it comes to planning by the state. So I can only imagine, some of the challenges in states unlike Maryland, for that matter. There's an interesting question, kind of being raised about this, but one that I think we see every day. So I'm curious, does anyone have any questions for Chris, or any comments to that effect? Yeah.
This is Stephanie. I raised my hand.
Oh, sorry. I can't see everybody right now.
Yeah. One of the questions I have is, the reason for neglect is variable, and does that variability affect the potential effectiveness of your proposal, Chris?
So the action of demolition by neglect can be categorized into 3 different types. There is purposeful demolition by neglect, which is the most sinister. That is when a developer or someone purposely neglects a building to skirt demolition prohibitions or historic preservation protections. But by far the most common is inadvertent. Inadvertent demolition by neglect happens because of lack of resources usually, but also other underlying issues like sometimes mental health or challenging ownership structures for buildings. And lastly, there is a category of benign demolition by neglect, which is, you know, attractive ruins, that sort of thing that Ruskin would have loved. But with the issue of, you know, the different categories and types and causes of demolition by neglect, and how that would affect any kind of protection scheme, merely having a protection scheme and the opportunity to notice property owners usually resolves, based on my research, the vast majority of demolition by neglect issues that are inadvertent. So just doing anything makes a huge impact. Every time that, you know, anecdotally, when I talk to CLGs in our state, that there have been issues of demolition by neglect that were acted upon, it was almost always through building code enforcement, and it never came to the point of the municipality having to intervene. The property owners usually took the notice and did something with it. Now, as for the more sinister, purposeful demolition by neglect, you know, that one of the images that I showed in my slideshow is the Steiniger Lodging House in downtown Phoenix, which really was the catalyst for Phoenix developing their ordinances past year. It was one of the last 50 19th century buildings left in town. It was very visibly right in the center of our downtown core, demolished by neglect over about a decade, and finally was torn down this last summer. You know, I as much as I want to come up with a policy that would be heavy-handed enough to stop purposeful demolition by neglect in urban cores like that, it's very difficult to be punitive enough to capture it. And I know that there are always going to be cases that are extremes that are difficult, but just finding a solution, something that communities can use to stop this issue, especially to stop inadvertent demolition by neglect. You know, that's where I think that regardless of the range of types of demolition by neglect, taking any action, really any of the three, a local ordinance, just building code enforcement, all of that is positive.
So I think it would be, if you haven't already included it in your discussion, a brief recap of what you just said in terms of identifying those three main change causes and why this is still, you know, the best option would be good.
I do. That's I want to say pages 3 through 5 of my paper. It's one of the first things that I touch on is why does demolition by neglect happen, and understanding that there are different causes. And, you know, that's one of the reasons why when you look at local ordinances, you do need different solutions. Phoenix may need to have fines baked into theirs that are significantly higher than in other places, or potentially be more aggressive, because the underlying value of land does create a financial incentive for demolition in Phoenix. That's very different from the kind of demolition by neglect that you see in, for example, Clifton that I keep citing.
Okay, thanks. Great discussion.
Christopher, this is Michael Spencer. I hope you can hear me okay. Quick question about, of course, I'm an educator, so I always have to ask an educational question here. But I know here in Fredericksburg, we've had issues in the past where complaints have been called in about a structure suffering from demo by neglect. And the solution has simply been a demolition order from a health, safety, welfare standpoint. And I'm curious in terms of what your ideas are in terms of preservation education of those enforcing the code.
So that certainly needs to happen. And this is actually a point that I make in my paper that was a little bit of a deep dive for my presentation. There are communities in Arizona, one notably called Superior, that under the auspices of blight mitigation go through their town annually and identify buildings that are suffering from demolition by neglect. And they either demolish them, or the city sometimes takes ownership of them, stabilizes them, and puts them up for sale. But the only way that they're able to do that, and Superior is a small community, again, of about 3,000 people, the only way that they're able to do that is with CDBG funds. Without outside funding sources, when you look to code enforcement, when you look to some of these things where you're essentially having the municipality or go in and stabilize and place liens on this property, which may never even get paid back if the cause of the demolition by neglect is, you know, a complicated ownership structure or lack of resources, there does need to be a commitment of resources or an availability of resources on the part of the community to go in and engage in that enhanced code enforcement, because a lot of times the community winds up owning the building at the end of the day, and they have to be prepared to do that. So that is one of the complicating factors of using enhanced code enforcement. But again, most of my research shows that simply noticing these property owners and simply starting the process achieves the desired result far more often than you have to go to the point of municipalities actually taking ownership of properties like that.
Chris Harrison, I live in a small community, and how do we become proactive? We meaning the public or the Historic Preservation Commission for the town? How does this begin? Who gets the building officials off center to the point of actually acting on something like this?
So that's where the solution of I guess I'm calling it the hybrid solution, because it involves code enforcement, but it also involves a local ordinance that involves the HP Commission comes in. What I would recommend to any small community is enact an ordinance that empowers your HP Commission to refer, to issue a petition for code enforcement to the building code official. And this is something that would come out of a normal meeting of your HP Commission. It would go to City Council along with all the other HP Commission recommendations. It would also go directly to the building code official. And if your HP Commission has said, hey, this building is really in trouble, I've read the International Property Maintenance Code if we've adopted it, or at a minimum, the International Building Code. It meets the definition of an unsafe structure and remediative action should be taken. If the building code official won't do anything about it, the HP Commission can just go to the mayor and go to council and say, look, this is our recommendation. We're the trained historic preservationists in this community. If you are electively as city council and mayor just going to let this be demolished, let that be known. But you have the administrative power, council and mayor, to instruct the building code official, if they are not already following through on our petition, to do so.
Thank you.
I see Will has had his hand up for a very long time, and he's in the top of my box, so I've just been watching him languish.
No, I just wanted to thank Chris for his research and presentation. It's just more of a comment. It's incredibly difficult researching local ordinances. There's thousands of them, and there's not a single clearinghouse for them. So you really have to start from scratch every time you tackle a new preservation law issue. So I think Chris's scholarship is going to go a long way to help filling gaps in our knowledge about demolition by neglect enforcement. And I'm very excited about some of the discoveries that Chris made along the way, as well as his pragmatic approach. I expect that because he's designed some of his recommendations for a state that tends to be very protective of private property rights, that you're going to see a lot of traction down the road in communities all across the country. It's one thing to design an ordinance like this for a city like Charleston or Annapolis or New Orleans or St. Augustine or Boston, where you've got already a lot of robust support for historic preservation. But that, as Chris rightly noted, it's nearly impossible to transplant ordinances like that at scale. So I have great hopes for Chris's research. I think the fact that it's designed for a regulatory environment that tends to be a little bit more difficult in terms of historic preservation is going to mean that his ideas will enjoy wide deployment. Thank you, Chris.
Well, I really appreciate those comments, Will. And I forgot, one of my big selling points in our very conservative private property rights state out here. At the end of the day, when you talk about enhanced code enforcement, my selling point to legislators or local decision makers is that we're not talking about making any new laws. We just want the law enforced. That's all that preservationists are asking for. And we are a pro law enforcement, anti-new law state. So I think that that's going to be a good approach for us.
Yeah, and one other thought, a good argument often to local governments is that demolition by neglect enforcement raises property values and therefore tax revenues. So that might help.
Absolutely. There's an economic and a cultural imperative to do this in our state. And one of the things that comes up a lot, the argument is that this is odorous to private property rights somehow, and that's an issue. But people that make those arguments about demolition by neglect, they conveniently forget that neglected structures negatively affect the full use and enjoyment of neighbors' private property rights. It's not just the private property rights of the building that's being neglected that matters. It's everyone else in the community who are being actively harmed.
Well, that might be a good place to sort of draw to our conclusion here and thank both Chris for his research, Will for his mentorship, and I think that this is a conversation that needs to be continued and needs to be spread far and wide, and this research needs to be shared far and wide. And so we're looking forward to getting you on PreserveCast, looking forward to taking this to the National Preservation Partners Network, which is the association of all the statewide and local preservation groups. Because as Will said, there's no one repository for these types of ordinances, but I know the Partners Network is one of the goals is to try and create a repository of good legislation, of good ordinances, sort of like NAPC does on the local side, but so that states can pick this up everywhere. So thank you, Chris, and obviously thank you, Harrison, for making this possible. And want to thank everyone who tuned into this, and there will be more information on the Preservation Maryland website.